So we finished up Volume 1, and now we're starting Volume 2. And Chapter 1. The Fingers of Aurora. Rosy-fingered Eos, so often mentioned in Homer, called Aurora by the Romans, caressed too with those fingers the first early morning of the archipelago. When our compatriots heard via the BBC that Mihailov claimed to have discovered the concentration camps that existed in our country as far back as 1921, many of us, and many in the West too, were astonished. That early, really, even in 1921? Of course not. Of course, Mihailov was in error. In 1921, in fact, concentration camps were already in full flower, already even coming to an end. It would be far more accurate to say that the archipelago was born with the shots of the cruiser Aurora. And how could it have been otherwise? Let us pause to ponder. Didn't Marx and Engels teach that the old bourgeois machinery of compulsion had to be broken up, and a new one created immediately in its place? And included in the machinery of compulsion were the army. We are not surprised that the army was created at the beginning of 1918. The police, the militia was inaugurated even sooner than the army. The courts from November 22nd, 1917, and the prisons. How, in establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat, could they delay with a new type of prison? That is to say, that it was altogether impermissible to delay in the matter of prisons, whether old or new. In the first months after the October Revolution, Lenin was already demanding the most decisive, draconic measures to tighten up discipline. And are draconic measures possible without prison? What new could the proletarian state contribute here? Lenin was feeling new paths. In December 1917, he suggested for consideration the following assortment of punishments: confiscation of all property, confinement in prison, dispatch to the front, and forced labor for all who disobey the existing law. Thus we can observe that the leading idea of the archipelago, forced labor, had been advanced in the first month after the October Revolution. And even while sitting peacefully among the fragrant hay mowings in Reslev and listening to the buzzing bumblebees, Lenin could not help but ponder the future penal system. Even then, he had worked things out and reassured us. The suppression of the minority of exploiters by the majority of the hired slaves of yesterday is a matter so comparatively easy, simple, and natural that it is going to cost much less blood, will be much cheaper for humanity than the preceding suppression of the majority by the minority. According to the estimates of emigre professor of statistics Kurganov, the comparatively easy internal repression cost us, from the beginning of the October Revolution up to 1959, a total of 60 million lives. We, of course, cannot vouch for this figure, but we have none other that is official. And just as soon as the official figure is issued, the specialists can make the necessary critical comparisons. It is interesting to compare other figures. How large was the total staff of the central apparatus of the terrifying Tsarist Third Department, which runs like a strand through all the great Russian literature? At the time of its creation, it had 16 persons, and at its height it had 45, a ridiculously small number, for even the remotest Cheka provincial headquarters in the country? Or how many political prisoners did the February Revolution find in the Tsarist prison of the peoples? All these figures do exist somewhere. In all probability, there were more than 100 such prisoners in the Kresty prison alone, and several hundred returned from Siberian exile and hard labor. How many more were laughing at the prison of how many more were languishing in the prison of every political capital? But it is interesting to know exactly how many. Here is a figure for Tambov, taken from the fiery local papers. The February Revolution, which opened wide the doors of the Tambov prison, found there political prisoners in the numbers of 7 persons, and there were more than 40 provinces. It is superfluous to recall that from February to July 1917, there were no political arrests, and after July the number imprisoned could be counted on one's fingers. Here, however, was the trouble. The first Soviet government was a coalition government, and a portion of the people's commissariats had to be allotted, like it or not, to the left socialist revolutionaries, including, unhappily, the People's Commissariat of Justice, which fell to them, guided by a rotten, petty bourgeois concept of freedom. This People's Commissariat of Justice brought the penal system to the verge of ruin. The sentences turned out to be too light, and they made hardly any use at all of the progressive principle of forced labor. In February 1918, the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, Comrade Lenin, demanded that the number of places of imprisonment be increased and that repression of criminals be intensified. And in May, already going over to concrete guidance, he gave instructions that the sentence for bribery must not be less than 10 years of prison and 10 years of forced labor, in addition, a total of 20 years. The scale might seem pessimistic at first. Would forced labor really still be necessary after 20 years? But we know that forced labor turned out to be a very long-lived measure, and that even after 50 years, it would still be extremely popular. For many months after the October Revolution, prison personnel everywhere remained Tsarist, and the only new officials named were People's Commissars of prisons. Brazen jailers went so far as to create their own trade union, the Union of Prison Employees, and established an elective basis for prison administration, the only time in all of Russian history. Prisoners were not to be left behind either. They too had their own internal self-government. The circular of the People's Commissariat of Justice, April 24, 1918. Prisoners, wherever possible, were to be brought into self-verification and self-supervision. Naturally, such a free commune of convicts, anarchical licentiousness, did not correspond to the needs of the dictatorship of the progressive class, and was of sorry help in purging harmful insects from the Russian land. And what could one expect if the prison chapels had not been closed, and our Soviet prisoners are willingly going there on Sundays, even if only to pass the time? Of course, even the Tsarist jailers were not entirely a loss to the proletariat, for after all, theirs was a profession important to the most immediate purposes of the revolution, and therefore it was necessary to select those persons of the prison administration who have not become totally calloused and stupefied in the patterns of Tsarist prisons. And what does not totally mean? And how would you find that out? Does it mean they had forgotten God Save the Tsar? who could be used for work at the new tasks. They did, for example, answer precisely yes sir and no sir, or turn the key in the lock quickly. And of course, prison buildings themselves, their cells, their bars and locks, although in appearance they remained exactly as before, in actual fact had acquired a new class content, a lofty revolutionary meaning. And nevertheless, the habit of the courts, right up to the middle of 1918, of keeping right on out of inertia, sentencing to prison, slowed up the breakup of the old machinery of state in its prison area. In the middle of 1918, to be exact, on July 6th, an event took place whose significance is not grasped by everyone, an event superficially known as the suppression of the revolt of the left socialist revolutionaries. But this was in fact a coup d'etat, and hardly any less significant than October 25th. On October 25th, the government of the Soviets of Workers' and Peasants' Deputies was proclaimed, whence the name Soviet power. But in its first months, this new government was very much beclouded by the presence in it of other parties besides the Bolsheviks. Although the coalition government consisted only of the Bolsheviks and the left socialist revolutionaries, nonetheless, in the membership of the All-Russian Congress, Second, Third, and Fourth, and of the All-Russian Central Executive Committees, which they elected, there were still included some representatives of other socialist parties, socialist revolutionaries, social democrats, anarchists, popular socialists, etc. Because of this fact, the VTIK possessed the unhealthy character of its socialist parliaments. But in the course of the first months of 1918, by a whole series of decisive measures supported by the left socialist revolutionaries, representatives of the other socialist parties were either expelled from VTIK by its own decision or by its own decision on original parliamentary procedure, or else were simply not allowed to be elected to it. The last non-Bolshevik party, which still constituted 1/3 of the parliament, the Fifth Congress of the Soviets, was the left socialist revolutionaries. And the time finally came to get rid of them too. On July 6, 1918, they were excluded in toto from VTIK and from the Council of People's Commissars. Thereby the power of the Soviet of Deputies, by tradition called the Soviet, ceased to stand in opposition to the will of the Bolshevik Party and took the form of the democracy of a new type. Only on this historic day could the reconstruction of the old prison machinery and the creation of the archipelago really begin. And the direction of this desired reconstruction had long since been understood. After all, Marx himself had pointed out in his critique of the Gotha program that productive labor was the only method of prisoner correction. If it's clear, of course, as Wyszynski explained much later on, what was meant here was not that kind of work which dries out the mind and the heart of a human being, but the miracle worker which transforms the people from non-existence and insignificance into heroes. Why is it that our prisoner must not chew the rag or read nice little books in his cell, but must labor instead? Because in the Republic of the Soviets there can be no place for forced idleness. Excuse me. for that forced parasitism which could exist in a parasitical society. For example, in Schusselburg, such idleness as this is on the part of the prisoners would have very simply been contrary to the basis of the work structure of the Soviet Republic as defined in the People's Constitution of July 10, 1918. He who does not work does not eat. Consequently, the prisoners were not set to work. They were, according to the Constitution, to be deprived of their bread ration. The Central Penal Department of the People's Commissariat of Justice, which had been created in May 1918, had immediately begun to send off to work the then existing sects, began to organize productive labor, but this legislation had been proclaimed only after the July coup, to be precise, July 23, 1918, in temporary instructions on deprivation of freedom. Those deprived of freedom who are capable of labor must be recruited for physical work on a compulsory basis. One can say that the camps originated and the archipelago was born from this particular instruction of July 23, 1918, 9 months after the October Revolution. Someone may enter a reproach that this birth was premature. The necessity of forced labor by prisoners, which was anyway quite clear for everyone by then, was further clarified at the 7th All-Union Congress of the Soviets. Labor is the best means of paralyzing the disintegrating influence of the endless conversations of prisoners among themselves, in the course of which the more experienced instruct the newcomers. So that's why. Soon after that, there began a communist Sputniki, voluntary Saturdays, and that same People's Commissariat of Justice issued an appeal. It is essential to teach the prisoners to become accustomed to communist collective labor. In other words, the spirit of the communist Sputniki, which was to be applied to the forced labor camps. And that is how the hasty epoch instantly heaped up a mountain of problems which it took decades to sort out. The bases of corrective labor policy were included in a party program at the 8th Congress of the Russian Communist Party, March 1919. The complete organizational structuring of the camp network through Soviet Russia coincided rigidly with the first communist Sputniki, April 12 to May 17, 1919. The decrees on witty on camps for forced labor were issued on April 15, 1919 and May 17, 1919. Under their provisions, camps for forced labor were obligatorily created by the provincial Cheka in each provincial capital, if convenient, within the city limits, or in a monastery or a nearby country estate, and also in several countries as well, although for the time being not in all of them. The camps were required to accommodate no fewer than 300 persons each, in order that the cost of the guard and the administration should be paid for by the prisoners' labor, and they were under the jurisdiction of the provincial penal departments. The early forced labor camps seem to us nowadays to be something intangible. The people imprisoned in them seem not to have said anything to anyone. There is no testimony. Literature and memoirs, when they speak of war communism, recall executions in prisons, but do not have a thing to say about camps. And nowhere, even between the lines, nowhere outside the text are they implied. So it was natural for Mihailovich Mihailov to make his mistake. Where were those camps? What were their names? What did they look like? The instruction of July 23, 1918 had the decisive fault noted by all the jurists. That nothing was mentioned here, nothing was mentioned there about class differentiation among the prisoners. In other words, that some prisoners should be maintained in better conditions and some in worse. But it did outline the labor system, and that is the only reason we can get any picture of what they were like. The workday was set at 8 hours because of the novelty of it all. The hasty decision was made to pay the prisoners for all their work, other than camp maintenance, at 100% of the rates of corresponding trade unions. Oh, what a monstrous thing. The pen can hardly bear to write it. They were being compelled to work by the Constitution. They were also being paid according to the same Constitution. Logical enough. It is true that the cost of maintenance of the camp and the camp guard was deducted from their wages. For conscientious prisoners, there was a special benefit to be allowed to live in a private apartment and come to the camp for work only, and release ahead of term was promised as a reward for special labor enthusiasm. And in general, there were no detailed instructions on the regimen, and every camp had its own. In the period of building a new governmental system, taking into account the great overcrowding of places of confinement, there was no time to think about the regimen in the camps. All the attention was directed to unburdening the prisons. Something like that reads like a hieroglyphic from Babylon. How many questions immediately suggest themselves? What is going on in those wretched prisons? And what were the social causes of such overcrowding? And is one to understand the matter of unburdening the prisons to mean executions or dispatching prisoners to camps? And what did it mean by saying it was impossible to give any thought to the regimen in the camps? Did this mean that the People's Commissariat of Justice did not have time to safeguard the prisoner against the arbitrary actions of the local camp chief? Is that the only way this can be read? There were no instructions about the regimen, and in the years of the revolutionary sense of justice, every petty tyrant could do just as he pleased with the prisoners. From the meager statistics, all from that very same collection, Soviet justice, we learn in the general work of the camps. In general, the work in the camps was menial. In 1919, only 2.5% of the prisoners worked in workshops, and in 1920, only 10%. It is also known that at the end of 1918, the Central Penal Department, what a moniker, it makes the flesh creep, sought the establishment of agricultural colonies. It is known that in Moscow, several brigades made up of prisoners were established to carry out repairs on water pipes, heating systems, and plumbing in nationalized buildings, and these apparently unescorted prisoners wandered about with monkey wrenches, soldering irons, and pipes through the corridors of government organizations and institutions. In the apartments of the bigwigs of those times, summoned by their wives by telephone to carry out repairs, and were never mentioned in any memoir, in any play, or in any film. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.